Sometimes the most profound moments come when we least expect them, through simple acts of kindness. In the 1800s frontier, one cowboy's compassionate heart would change everything he understood about wild horses. When he heard desperate cries from a thorny ravine, he didn't hesitate. A wild foal was trapped, bleeding and terrified. Most men would have ridden on, but this cowboy couldn't ignore suffering. He risked his safety to free the young horse, tending its wounds with care. As he prepared to leave, the earth trembled. The entire wild herd emerged, surrounding him. In that breathtaking moment, instead of charging, the lead stallion did something that defied everything cowboys knew. What happened next would become frontier legend. But could it be true? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something for you. Samuel Hartwell had always risen with the sun, but these days it felt more like habit than purpose. At 45, his weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he adjusted the cinch on his father's old leather saddle, its surface worn smooth by 3 generations of Hartwell men. The saddle bore the scratches and stains of countless rides across unforgiving terrain, yet it remained as sturdy as the day his grandfather first threw it across a horse's back in Kentucky, decades before the family's westward migration. The Wyoming Territory morning air cut sharp against Sam's cheeks as he led Thunder, his aging bay Mustang, from the small barn he'd built with his own hands 7 years prior. Thunder's breath formed small clouds in the crisp air, and the horse's dark eyes held the same quiet understanding that had sustained their partnership through lean winters and abundant summers alike. The Mustang had been young and wild when Sam first gentled him, but time had seasoned them both into a comfortable rhythm of mutual respect. Sam's homestead stretched across a modest valley between 2 ridges of weathered sandstone, far enough from the nearest neighbor to ensure solitude, close enough to town for supplies when necessity demanded. The log cabin he'd built for his bride stood solid against the elements, its chinked walls and sturdy roof a testament to his determination to create something lasting in this harsh land. Martha had loved this place from the moment they'd claimed it, often standing on the wooden porch in the evenings, watching the light fade behind the western peaks while she planned their future. 3 years had passed since fever took her, yet Sam still found himself listening for her voice in the morning stillness, still setting 2 cups on the rough-hewn table before catching himself. The silence that filled their home now felt different from the peaceful quiet they'd shared, where once the absence of words had spoken of contentment. Now it echoed with all the conversations they'd never have, all the dreams that had died with her. The daily routine of checking his small herd of cattle provided structure when grief threatened to overwhelm purpose. Sam mounted Thunder with the fluid motion of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on the ground, and they set off toward the northern pasture where his 30 head of longhorn grazed. These cattle represented his livelihood, his connection to the world beyond his valley, and his reason for continuing when the weight of solitude pressed heavy on his shoulders. The landscape revealed itself slowly as they rode, painted in the muted colors of early autumn. Golden grass bent before a persistent wind, and the cottonwoods along Willow Creek had begun their annual transformation, leaves shifting from green to amber. Sam had learned to read this land like scripture, understanding its moods and seasons, knowing where to find water during drought and shelter during storms. It was knowledge passed down from his father, who'd learned it from his father before him, each generation adding wisdom earned through hardship and observation. Thunder's ears pricked forward as they crested a low rise, and Sam automatically scanned the horizon for anything unusual. Living alone in territory where dangers ranged from cattle rustlers to territorial wolves required constant vigilance, but it had become second nature after so many years. The cattle grazed peacefully. In the distance, their russet hides warm against the pale grass. and Sam counted them with a practiced eye. All present, all healthy, another small blessing in a life that had taught him to appreciate such simple confirmations. His nearest neighbors, the Caldwell family, lived 8 miles southeast on a larger spread that supported twice as many cattle, and 3 times as many opinions about how the territory should be run. Jacob Caldwell was a good man, fair in his dealings, and generous with assistance during difficult times, but his wife Evelyn possessed a tongue sharp enough to cut leather, and opinions about Sam's solitary lifestyle that she shared freely during his infrequent visits to their ranch. Their 2 sons, Thomas and William, showed promise as ranchers, but they were still young enough to view Sam's quiet competence with the mixture of respect and puzzlement reserved for men who chose isolation over community. The town of Dry Creek lay 12 miles south of Sam's homestead, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around the convergence of 3 wagon trails. With a population that swelled to nearly 200 during cattle driving season, it served as the commercial heart of a region where neighbors might live 20 miles apart. Sam made the journey to town once a month, selling beef to the local butcher, purchasing supplies from Morrison's general store, and enduring the well-meaning but persistent attempts of various widows to engage him in conversation that might lead to courtship. He understood their motivations. A man alone in this country faced challenges that partnership could ease, and the community's desire to see him settled again stemmed from genuine concern for his welfare. But the idea of replacing Martha felt like betrayal, and the thought of learning to love another woman seemed as foreign as speaking a language he'd never heard. His heart had room for grief and memory, for the daily work that sustained life and the small satisfactions of a well-tended homestead, but it remained closed to possibilities that might diminish the purity of what he'd lost. Thunders steady. A gate carried them along familiar paths worn by years of travel, past landmarks that marked the boundaries of Sam's known world. The twisted pine where he'd taken shelter during his first Wyoming blizzard still stood sentinel on the eastern ridge. The natural spring where he'd proposed to Martha continued to bubble from its rocky source, its water as clear and sweet as the day he'd first cupped it in his palms to offer her a drink. These places held stories, memories embedded in stone and soil, creating a geography of the heart that no surveyor could map. The morning sun climbed higher as they completed the cattle check and turned toward home. Sam's practiced eye noted the approaching change in weather. Clouds building beyond the mountains, the subtle shift in wind direction that suggested rain before evening. Thunder felt it too, his step quickening with the anticipation of shelter and grain. They'd learned to read each other's thoughts across the years, man and horse, united in the simple understanding that survival required attention to details others might miss. As they approached the homestead, Sam noticed fresh deer tracks near the creek, a reminder that wildlife moved freely across his land in patterns older than human settlement. He'd always felt a kinship with the animals that shared this harsh country, understanding their need for water, shelter, and the endless search for sustenance that drove all living things. Martha had encouraged this connection, often reminding him that gentleness with animals reflected the condition of a man's soul. The old medicine pouch she'd sewn for him still hung from his saddle horn, its leather darkened by weather and use. Inside, she'd placed herbs gathered from the surrounding hills, yarrow for wounds, willow bark for pain, sage for purification. Living things help each other, she'd said when presenting it to him. That's how we know we're part of something larger than ourselves. He'd used its contents many times over the years, treating cuts on cattle, soothing Thunder's occasional lameness, and finding comfort in the ritual of healing that connected him to her memory. The afternoon stretched ahead with familiar tasks, mending a section of fence damaged by wind, checking the root cellar where winter supplies waited in neat rows, writing in the ledger where he tracked expenses and income, with the careful precision of a man who understood that small margins meant the difference between prosperity and failure. These activities provided rhythm to days that might otherwise blur together in an endless succession of solitary hours. But as he unsaddled Thunder and rubbed the horse down with practiced strokes, Sam felt a stirring of restlessness that had grown stronger in recent weeks. The seasonal changes that once marked time's passage now seemed to highlight the unchanging nature of his existence. The same routines, the same thoughts, the same careful avoidance of any path that might lead toward connection or change. Perhaps it was the approaching anniversary of Martha's death that made him more aware of time's passage, or maybe the sight of migrating birds reminded him that movement was natural, that staying in one place too long could become a trap disguised as faithfulness. Whatever the cause, Samuel Hartwell found himself wondering if the life he'd built in grief's shadow truly honored his wife's memory, or if it had become a monument to his own fear of facing an uncertain future. The morning of September 15th began like countless others, with Sam saddling Thunder in the pale light that preceded sunrise. His plan was simple: ride the northern boundary to check for breaks in the fence line that separated his modest grazing land from the vast wilderness beyond. These routine patrols had become second nature, a methodical process of observation and maintenance that kept his small operation functioning smoothly. Thunder seemed unusually alert as they rode toward Red Rock Canyon, his ears constantly shifting direction as if tracking sounds Sam couldn't hear. The horse's behavior struck him as odd. Thunder was typically calm during these familiar rides, but today he displayed an edginess that made Sam more attentive to their surroundings. The morning air carried a crispness that spoke of winter's approach, and the golden grass rippled in waves before a steady wind from the west. They'd ridden perhaps 3 miles when Sam first heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind through the rocks. But Thunder's reaction was immediate and pronounced. The Mustang stopped abruptly, head raised, nostrils flaring, as he tested the air for scents that might explain what his ears had detected. Sam listened carefully, and there it came again. A desperate, plaintive cry that seemed to echo from the direction of Red Rock Canyon. The sound was unmistakably that of a horse in distress, but something about its pitch suggested youth. A foal, perhaps, though what a young horse might be doing alone in this remote area puzzled Sam. The nearest wild herd typically grazed 15 miles north, and domestic horses rarely wandered this far from established ranches. Still, the desperation in that cry struck something deep in Sam's chest, awakening instincts Martha had always insisted were the best part of his nature. Thunder needed no urging to investigate. The Mustang picked his way carefully down the rocky slope that led to the canyon floor, his sure-footedness the product of years navigating this challenging terrain. As they descended, the cries became more frequent and more urgent, confirming Sam's suspicion that whatever creature was making them was in serious trouble. The canyon opened before them like a cathedral carved from red sandstone, its walls rising, nearly 100 feet on either side. Ancient water had carved smooth curves into the rock, creating alcoves and overhangs that provided shelter for various forms of wildlife. Sam had explored this canyon many times, appreciating its stark beauty and the sense of solitude it offered. But he'd never heard sounds like the ones that now echoed off its walls. Following the source of the distress calls, Sam guided Thunder deeper into the canyon until they rounded a bend that revealed a sight that made his heart clench with sympathy. Trapped in a dense thicket of thorny brush was a young horse, a foal no more than 4 months old, its dark coat marked with the distinctive coloring of a wild Mustang. The animal had obviously struggled for some time, as evidenced by the numerous scratches across its legs and flanks where the thorns had drawn blood. But what struck Sam most forcefully was the foal's eyes, dark, intelligent, and filled with a terror that went beyond simple physical distress. This was a creature that had never known human contact, whose very instincts screamed warnings about the approaching man and horse. Yet desperation had overcome fear, and the foal's cries continued, pleading for help from any source that might provide it. Sam dismounted slowly, speaking in the low, gentle tones he'd always used with frightened animals. "Easy there, young one," he murmured, approaching the thicket with careful steps. "I'm not here to hurt you. Let's see what we can do about getting you free." As he moved closer, Sam noticed something that deepened the mystery of the foal's presence. In this remote location, tangled in the brush near the trapped animal, was a broken bridle, its leather cracked and weathered, but bearing a silver buckle that spoke of quality craftsmanship. Someone had owned this foal, had cared enough to invest in proper tack, yet here it was, alone and injured in a place where domestic horses rarely ventured. The bridle told a story Sam could only guess at. Perhaps a family moving west had lost their animals to rustlers or wolves, or maybe a rancher's breeding stock had escaped and scattered during a storm. Whatever the circumstances, this young horse had somehow ended up miles from any human settlement, trapped and likely to die without intervention. Working his way carefully into the thorny brush, Sam began the delicate process of freeing the foal. Each movement required patience. Too sudden a gesture might panic the animal into struggling harder and inflicting worse injuries on itself. The thorns caught at his clothing and scratched his hands, but Sam barely noticed. His entire focus was on the terrified creature whose trust he was trying to earn through gentleness and persistence. "That's it," he whispered as the foal gradually stopped struggling, perhaps recognizing that this human meant no harm. "Let me help you. We'll have you out of there in no time." The work was painstaking, requiring Sam to break or bend back dozens of thorny branches while avoiding any sudden movement that might renew the foal's panic. Thunder waited patiently nearby, occasionally nickering soft encouragement as if he understood the importance of what his partner was attempting. The Mustang had always possessed an unusual calm around other horses, a quality that served him well in this tense situation. When the foal was finally free, Sam's shirt was torn and his arms were striped with shallow cuts from the thorns, but his attention remained focused on the injured animal. The foal stood on shaking legs, its dark eyes still wary, but no longer filled with pure terror. Several cuts on its legs were bleeding steadily, and Sam knew that without treatment, infection could easily claim the young horse's life. From the medicine pouch Martha had made him, Sam withdrew clean cloth and a small vial of healing salve. Moving slowly and speaking constantly in soothing tones, he began cleaning the foal's wounds. To his amazement, the young horse allowed this treatment with only minimal resistance, as if it somehow understood that the human's intentions were benevolent. "You're a brave one," Sam murmured as he worked. "Most wild things wouldn't let a man touch them, no matter how much trouble they were in. But you're different, aren't you?" The foal's response was a soft whicker that seemed to express both gratitude and continued uncertainty. Sam had never experienced anything quite like this moment, the profound connection that seemed to exist between him and this wild creature, the sense that something significant was occurring beyond the simple rescue of an injured animal. As he finished bandaging the foal's wounds, Sam became aware that Thunder had grown increasingly agitated. The Mustang was staring toward the canyon's mouth, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with alertness. Following his horse's gaze, Sam heard what had captured Thunder's attention, a sound that made his blood run cold. From the direction they had entered the canyon came the unmistakable thunder of multiple horses moving at speed. Not the random scatter of spooked domestic animals, but the coordinated movement of a herd running with purpose. Sam's mind raced through the implications. If this foal belonged to a wild herd, and if that herd had come looking for their missing member, he was about to face a situation no cowboy wanted to encounter. Wild Mustangs were notoriously protective of their young, and a stallion leading his herd to recover a foal would see any human presence as a threat to be eliminated. Sam looked around quickly, assessing his options. The canyon walls were too steep to climb quickly, and the narrow passage offered no room to maneuver if a herd of wild horses decided he represented danger to their young. The ground beneath his feet began to vibrate with the approach of many hooves, and Sam knew that whatever was about to happen would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the small, trusting creature he had just rescued from the thorns. The wild herd appeared at the canyon's mouth like something from an ancient legend, their forms silhouetted against the morning sky in a display of raw power that took Sam's breath away. He counted at least 20 horses, ranging from seasoned mares to young stallions, but his attention was immediately drawn to the magnificent black stallion who led them. The animal stood nearly 17 hands high, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the early light, his bearing radiating the confidence of a leader who had never known defeat. Sam remained perfectly still beside the injured foal, one hand resting gently on the young horse's neck in what he hoped would be interpreted as protection rather than possession. Thunder, wise in the ways of horse politics, lowered his head in a gesture of submission that Sam prayed would help communicate their peaceful intentions to the approaching herd. The descent into the canyon was a masterpiece of controlled movement. Each horse picked its way carefully down the rocky slope, following paths worn by generations of wild animals seeking water and shelter. The mares stayed close to their own foals, while the younger stallions flanked the group with the alert postures of warriors ready to defend their family. It was a level of organization that spoke to the intelligence and experience of their leader. As the herd reached the canyon floor, they arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around Sam and the injured foal. The black stallion approached slowly, his dark eyes fixed on Sam with an intensity that seemed to look directly into his soul. There was intelligence in that gaze, and something else, a wariness tempered by curiosity, as if the stallion was trying to understand what manner of human would risk himself to help a creature that belonged to the wild. Sam could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, but he forced himself to remain calm. Any sudden movement or sign of fear could trigger an attack that would end badly for everyone involved. Instead, he continued to speak in the gentle tones Martha had always loved, the voice he used when approaching any frightened animal. "I found him trapped," Sam said quietly, his words directed to the stallion as if the animal could understand every syllable. "He was hurt, bleeding. I couldn't leave him there to die." The stallion stopped just beyond arm's reach, his nostrils flaring as he tested Sam's scent for signs of aggression or deception. The foal, apparently recognizing the leader of his herd, whickered softly and tried to move toward him, but his injured legs made the effort clumsy and painful. The stallion's response was immediate, a deep, rumbling nicker of reassurance that seemed to calm not only the foal, but the entire herd. What happened next defied everything Sam thought he knew about wild horses. Instead of driving him away from the foal, the stallion lowered his great head and gently nuzzled Sam's shoulder, sniffing the places where his clothes had been torn by thorns and stained by the foal's blood. It was an examination, Sam realized. The stallion determining through scent whether this human had helped or harmed the young member of his herd. The touch of the stallion's muzzle against his shoulder sent an electric thrill through Sam's entire body. No wild horse had ever voluntarily made contact with him, and certainly never with such obvious trust. The moment stretched between them, man and stallion connected by something that transcended the usual barriers between species. In the stallion's dark eyes, Sam saw recognition, not of him as an individual, but of him as someone who understood the sacred bond between protector and protected. When the stallion stepped back, his movement was slow and deliberate, lacking any trace of the aggressive posturing Sam had expected. Instead, the great horse turned his attention to the injured foal, examining the bandages with gentle nudges and seeming to approve of the care that had been provided. The other horses followed their leader's example, gradually relaxing their defensive positions as they recognized that no threat existed in this strange tableau. Sam reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew the small wooden whistle Martha had carved for him during their second winter together. She'd made it from a piece of cedar, carefully shaping it to produce the soft, warbling call he used to summon thunder from distant pastures. The whistle had been her gift to him after watching him spend an entire afternoon calling for his horse, in a voice grown hoarse from shouting. "For the times when your voice isn't enough," she'd said with the gentle smile that had first captured his heart. "Animals respond to music in ways we don't always understand." Now, uncertain of what impulse drove him, Sam lifted the whistle to his lips and produced a series of soft, melodic notes. The sound echoed gently off the canyon walls, creating harmonies that seemed to speak of peace and understanding. The effect on the herd was remarkable. Ears that had been alert for signs of danger now pricked forward with interest, and several of the younger horses actually stepped closer, drawn by the unfamiliar but somehow appealing sound. The black stallion's reaction was the most profound. His head tilted slightly, as if he was listening not just to the notes themselves, but to the intention behind them. When Sam lowered the whistle, the stallion responded with a soft whicker that seemed to carry approval, even invitation. It was a sound Sam would remember for the rest of his life, the moment when a wild stallion accepted him as something more than just another human to be avoided or feared. The injured foal, meanwhile, had been growing stronger as the minutes passed. The rest seemed to have restored some of his energy, and the presence of his herd had clearly lifted his spirits. But when Sam began to gather his medical supplies, preparing to leave the young horse to his family, something unexpected happened. The foal limped after him, whickering plaintively as if reluctant to see his rescuer depart. Sam knelt beside the foal, gently stroking the young animal's neck. "You belong with them," he whispered. "They're your family. They'll take care of you." Now, but the foal pressed against him, seeking the warmth and comfort that Sam's gentle care had provided. The stallion watched this interaction with what seemed like thoughtful consideration, as if weighing options that went beyond the simple recovery of a lost herd member. After several long moments, the stallion approached them again. This time, he extended his muzzle toward Sam's face in a gesture of unmistakable trust and respect. The great horse's breath was warm against Sam's cheek, carrying the clean scent of prairie grass and wild freedom. When he pulled back, his eyes seemed to hold a message Sam struggled to interpret. Then, in a display of leadership that left Sam stunned, the stallion turned and led his herd back up the canyon slopes, leaving the injured foal behind. It wasn't abandonment. Sam could see in the stallion's backward glances that this was a conscious decision, a gift of trust that acknowledged what had occurred between human and horses in this ancient place. The ride home from Red Rock Canyon proved more challenging than Sam had anticipated. The young foal, whom he had already begun thinking of as spirit because of the resilient courage the animal had shown, could manage only a slow, careful pace on his injured legs. Thunder seemed to understand the situation instinctively, adjusting, his normally eager stride to match the foal's limited capabilities. What struck Sam most profoundly was Spirit's behavior during the journey. Rather than displaying the fearful wariness typical of wild horses around humans, the foal stayed close to Thunder's side, occasionally brushing against Sam's leg as if seeking reassurance. It was unprecedented in Sam's experience. A wild animal, not merely tolerating human presence, but actively seeking comfort from it. As they crested the ridge that overlooked his homestead, Sam felt a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. He'd rescued injured animals before, but they had always been domestic creatures whose return to health simply meant resuming their previous lives. Spirit represented something entirely different, a wild horse whose very nature might be compromised by too much human contact, yet whose survival currently depended on exactly that contact. The barn he'd built 5 years earlier had been designed primarily for Thunder and the occasional injured cow, but it would serve adequately for Spirit's recovery. Sam prepared a stall with fresh straw, ensuring the gate could be left open so the foal wouldn't feel trapped. Water and a mixture of grain and chopped hay completed the preparations, though he wondered if a wild horse would accept such domesticated fare. His concerns proved unfounded. Spirit approached the food cautiously, but began eating with the healthy appetite of a young animal whose body was working to heal itself. The sight of the foal's obvious enjoyment of the meal brought Sam a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. The deep contentment that comes from providing for a creature in need. That evening, Sam sat on a hay bale in the barn, reading from Martha's old recipe journal by the light of a kerosene lantern. The leather-bound book had been her treasure, filled with remedies she'd learned from her mother and grandmother, along with discoveries she'd made during their years on the frontier. Her careful handwriting covered pages devoted to treating everything from fever to wounds to the various ailments that could affect livestock. For deep cuts on horses, read one entry in Martha's distinctive script: combine willow bark tea with crushed plantain leaves. Apply directly to wound and bind with clean cloth. Change dressing twice daily until proud flesh forms. Sam had used this recipe successfully on Thunder after the Mustang had tangled with barbed wire the previous spring, and he saw no reason it wouldn't work equally well on Spirit's injuries. The foal watched him with curious eyes as Sam prepared the mixture, grinding the willow bark in Martha's old mortar and pestle, while water heated on the small stove he kept in the barn for winter. Emergencies. The familiar ritual of following his wife's careful instructions brought her presence close, as if she were guiding his hands in the work of healing. Spirit accepted the treatment with remarkable patience, standing quietly as Sam cleaned his wounds and applied fresh bandages. The foal's trust was both touching and troubling. Such acceptance of human handling was not natural for a wild horse, and Sam wondered if he was inadvertently domesticating a creature that belonged to the freedom of open plains. By the third day, Spirit was following Sam around the homestead with the devotion of a well-trained dog. The foal had discovered that the human's activities often involved interesting sights, sounds, and smells, and his natural curiosity overcame any remaining wariness. When Sam went to check on his cattle, Spirit limped along behind. When he mended fences, the foal grazed nearby, always keeping the man within sight. This behavior both delighted and concerned Sam, the joy of having another living creature share. His daily routines helped fill the silence that had oppressed him since Martha's death. Spirit's presence transformed the homestead from a place of solitary work into something approaching companionship. Yet Sam couldn't escape the knowledge that he was changing the foal's essential nature with every passing day. The arrival of Jacob Caldwell on the fourth morning brought these concerns into sharp focus. Sam's neighbor rode up to the cabin with the easy familiarity of a man who'd been making such visits for years, but his expression changed dramatically when he spotted Spirit grazing near the barn. "Sam, where in blazes did you get that Mustang?" Jacob asked, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose bones had begun to protest long days in the saddle. "That's no ranch horse. Look at those markings, that conformation. That's wild stock if I ever saw it." Sam explained the circumstances of the rescue, watching Jacob's expression shift from curiosity to concern as the story unfolded. His neighbor was a practical man who understood the unforgiving realities of frontier life, and his response reflected that pragmatism. "You did right by helping an injured animal," Jacob said finally. "But keeping a wild horse is asking for trouble. Sam, that foal's herd is probably still looking for him, and wild stallions don't take kindly to humans interfering with their family groups. Besides, the longer you keep him, the more attached he'll get, and the harder it'll be to return him to where he belongs." The words struck home because they echoed Sam's own doubts. He'd been avoiding the question of Spirit's future, focusing instead on the immediate needs of healing and care. But Jacob's visit forced him to confront the reality that his actions, however well-intentioned, had consequences that extended far beyond the simple rescue of one injured animal. That evening, Sam sat on his porch, watching Spirit graze in the small paddock he'd hastily constructed near the barn. The foal's wounds were healing cleanly, and his strength was returning daily. Soon he would be capable of surviving on his own again, of returning to the wild herd that was surely his rightful place. Yet the thought of sending Spirit back to the canyon filled Sam with a sadness he hadn't expected. In the growing dusk, the wildlife seemed drawn to the homestead in unusual numbers. A pair of red-tailed hawks had taken up residence in the cottonwood near the creek, their presence adding a wild majesty to the domestic tranquility of the ranch. Deer grazed closer to the cabin than ever before, as if Spirit's presence somehow signaled that this was a place where wild creatures could find safety. Most remarkably, Sam had glimpsed what he was certain was a wolf watching from the ridge above the homestead. The sight should have alarmed him, but something about the animal's posture suggested observation rather than predation, as if the wolf, like the other creatures, was drawn by the unusual harmony that seemed to exist between the wild foal and the gentle human who cared for him. 2 weeks after the rescue, Sam knew he could delay the inevitable no longer. Spirit's wounds had healed completely, leaving only faint scars beneath his dark coat as reminders of his ordeal in the thorny brush. The young horse had grown visibly stronger, his movements regaining the fluid grace that marked him as a child of the wind and open spaces. Yet he showed no inclination to leave the homestead, seeming perfectly content to follow Sam through his daily routines. The night before Sam planned to return Spirit to Red Rock Canyon, he sat at his rough kitchen table examining the faded daguerreotype he kept in Martha's jewelry box. The photograph, taken on their wedding day in St. Louis 12 years earlier, showed a younger version of himself standing beside the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Martha's dress was simple but elegant, her dark hair arranged in the elaborate style fashionable at the time. But it was her eyes that drew his attention, bright with hope and completely trusting in their shared future. "I don't know what to do, Martha," he whispered to the photograph, as he had done countless times during the dark months after her death. "That foal belongs in the wild, but he's chosen to stay with me. How do I honor what's right for him when my heart wants to keep him close?" The silence that answered him felt different somehow, less empty than it had in recent years. Perhaps it was Spirit's gentle breathing from the barn, or the soft sounds of the night creatures that had begun gathering around the homestead. But Sam sensed something approaching peace in the solitude that had once felt so oppressive. The morning dawned clear and cool, with the crisp air that spoke of autumn's advance across the Wyoming territory. Sam saddled Thunder with unusual care, knowing this ride might be the last time the Mustang would carry both him and his unlikely companion. Spirit waited by the barn, somehow understanding that this day would be different, his dark eyes holding a wisdom that seemed far beyond his few months of life. The journey to Red Rock Canyon passed in contemplative silence. Spirit kept pace with Thunder easily, his healing complete and his strength fully restored. Yet something in his demeanor suggested resignation rather than eagerness, as if he sensed the purpose of this expedition and accepted it with the same grace he had shown throughout his recovery. As they approached the canyon where everything had begun, Sam felt his heart growing heavy with the weight of impending separation. He had tried to prepare himself for this moment, telling himself repeatedly that releasing Spirit was the right thing to do. But the actual prospect of watching the foal disappear into the wilderness left him feeling hollow in ways he hadn't experienced since Martha's funeral. They reached the spot where Sam had first found Spirit, trapped in the thorns, and he dismounted to check the area one final time. The broken bridle was gone, probably carried away by scavengers or weathered to fragments by the elements. But the memory of that desperate rescue remained vivid in every detail. Sam ran his fingers along the rocks where Spirit's blood had stained. The sandstone, marveling at how such a small event could have created such profound changes in his life. Spirit approached him as he knelt by the rocks, gently nuzzling his shoulder in a gesture that had become familiar during their weeks together. The foal's touch was warm and comforting, carrying the unmistakable message of trust that had characterized their relationship from its earliest moments. Sam wrapped his arms around Spirit's neck, breathing in the clean scent of horse and prairie grass, trying to memorize every detail of this final moment of closeness. "You need to go back to your family," Sam whispered into the foal's mane. "They're your real home, not my little ranch. You belong with creatures who understand what it means to be truly free." But as if summoned by those words, the sound of approaching hooves echoed through the canyon. Sam looked up to see the wild herd descending the rocky slopes with the same majestic precision they had displayed during their first encounter. The black stallion led them with regal bearing, his dark coat gleaming in the morning sunlight, his eyes fixed on the small group of humans and horses below. Sam's heart raced as the herd arranged themselves in the familiar semicircle, their attention focused primarily on Spirit, but including him in their watchful assessment. The foal immediately began moving toward his family, limping only slightly on legs that had grown strong during his convalescence. This was the moment Sam had been dreading, the final separation that would return his life to its former solitude. But Spirit stopped halfway to the herd and turned back to look at Sam. The foal's eyes held an expression of such profound conflict that Sam felt his own heart breaking in response. Here was a young creature torn between the call of his wild heritage and the bonds of affection he had formed with the human who had saved his life. The black stallion observed this display with the patient wisdom of a leader who understood the complexities of loyalty and belonging. Slowly, deliberately, he approached the conflicted foal and gently nuzzled him, as if offering reassurance and guidance. But instead of leading Spirit away, the stallion did something that left Sam stunned. He approached Sam directly, moving with the confident bearing of an equal rather than the wary suspicion of a wild animal encountering a potential threat. When he reached Sam, the great horse extended his muzzle and gently touched the man's face in a gesture of unmistakable acceptance. The contact lasted only moments, but in that brief touch, Sam felt recognition pass between them, an acknowledgement that transcended the boundaries between wild and domestic, human and animal. When the stallion stepped back, his eyes seemed to hold a message Sam struggled to interpret. Then, in a display of leadership that defied everything Sam thought he knew about wild horse behavior, the stallion turned and led his herd back up the canyon walls, once again leaving Spirit behind, but this time felt different. The stallion's backward glance seemed to carry invitation rather than abandonment, as if he was saying that Spirit could choose his own path, remain with the human who had shown such care, or return to the wild when ready. It was a gift of unprecedented trust, an acknowledgement that some bonds transcended the simple categories of wild and domestic. As the herd disappeared over the canyon rim, Sam found himself alone with Spirit and a decision he had never expected to face. The foal looked up at him with eyes that held both question and hope, waiting to see what their future might hold. The bond between Sam and Spirit deepened over the following weeks, as autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and russet. The young horse had clearly made his choice to remain at the homestead, though he maintained an alertness to the surrounding wilderness that spoke of his wild heritage. Sam found himself marveling at how naturally Spirit had adapted to life on the ranch, while never losing the essential wildness that made him magnificent. Their daily routines had evolved to include Spirit's presence as naturally as if the foal had been born on the homestead. When Sam rode out to check his cattle, Spirit followed on foot, his stamina and speed increasing daily as his body matured. The young horse displayed an uncanny ability to anticipate Sam's intentions, often moving toward a particular section of fence before Sam had even decided it needed attention. But it was during the quiet evening hours that their connection felt most profound. Sam had taken to sitting on his porch after the day's work was done, reading by lamplight while Spirit grazed nearby. The foal would often approach during these peaceful moments, resting his muzzle on Sam's shoulder while the man read aloud from Martha's favorite books. It was a ritual that brought Sam more comfort than he had thought possible, filling the silence that had once felt so oppressive with companionship, that asked nothing but offered everything. The first warning of trouble came from an unexpected source. Jeb Morrison, the owner of Dry Creek's General Store, arrived at Sam's homestead one morning with news that made Sam's blood run cold. A traveling merchant had brought word that a notorious gang of horse thieves was operating in the territory, moving systematically from ranch to ranch and stealing anything with 4 legs and value. They call their leader Iron Pete Mackenzie, Jeb explained, his weathered face grave with concern. Word is he's got 5 men with him, all of them meaner than rattlesnakes and twice as dangerous. They've hit 3 ranches in the past month, taking everything from breeding stock to workhorses. The territorial marshals got a reward posted, but these fellows are smart. They hit fast and disappear into country where law enforcement can't follow. Sam listened to this news with growing unease, his mind immediately turning to the wild herd that had shown him such unprecedented trust. If Mackenzie's gang was targeting horses throughout the territory, it was only a matter of time before they discovered the magnificent mustangs that grazed in the remote valleys beyond Red Rock Canyon. The thought of those noble creatures falling into the hands of ruthless thieves filled Sam with a protective anger he hadn't felt since Martha's death. After Jeb departed, Sam retrieved his father's old spyglass from the wooden chest where he kept his most precious possessions. The brass instrument had served his father well during the Mexican-American War, and Sam had inherited it, along with the stories of its use in scouting enemy positions and watching for threats across vast distances. Now, it might serve a similar purpose in protecting creatures he had come to regard as family. From the highest ridge on his property, Sam could survey miles of surrounding territory through the spyglass. The autumn air was crisp and clear, perfect for long-distance observation, and he began a systematic search of the landscape for any signs of the approaching threat. The valleys and draws that provided natural highways for traveling groups revealed nothing unusual on the first day, but Sam's instincts told him that patience would be required. Spirit seemed to sense his human's heightened alertness and began displaying his own signs of unease. The young horse would stand motionless for long periods, ears pricked toward distant sounds that Sam couldn't detect, his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind for unfamiliar scents. It was behavior Sam recognized from Thunder's younger days, the hypervigilance of a prey animal that sensed danger approaching. On the 3rd day of his surveillance, Sam's patience was rewarded with a sighting that confirmed his worst fears. Through the spyglass, he observed a group of riders moving along a distant ridge, their formation and behavior suggesting men accustomed to avoiding detection. They paused frequently to study the terrain ahead, and their horses bore the lean, hard-used look of animals pushed to travel fast and far. Sam counted 5 men, just as the merchant had reported, and their leader rode a distinctive grey stallion that seemed to command the respect of both horse and riders. Even at distance, there was something about the man's bearing that spoke of authority built on violence and intimidation. This had to be Iron Pete Mackenzie and his gang, scouting the area for their next target. What concerned Sam most was the direction of their travel. They were moving steadily toward the region where the wild herd typically grazed, following game trails that would eventually lead them to discover some of the most magnificent horses in the territory. Sam's mind raced through the implications. If Mackenzie's gang found the herd, they would certainly attempt to capture them, and wild horses driven by fear and unfamiliar with human handling could easily be injured or killed in the process. That evening, as Sam sat on his porch with Spirit beside him, he faced a decision that would have seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. The safe choice was to mind his own business, protect his own property, and hope the thieves would pass through the area without discovering the wild herd. But the memory of the black stallion's trust, the image of those magnificent creatures, accepting him as something approaching family, made that option feel like betrayal. The alternative was to somehow warn the herd of the approaching danger, a task that seemed nearly impossible but felt morally necessary. Sam had no illusions about his ability to communicate complex information to wild horses, but he had witnessed their intelligence and capacity for understanding firsthand. Perhaps, if he could reach them in time, some form of warning might be possible. As darkness fell across the homestead, Sam made his decision. Tomorrow he would ride to find the wild herd and attempt something no cowboy had ever tried, convincing a group of wild horses to trust his warning about a danger they had never experienced. It was a plan that bordered on foolishness, but the alternative was to stand by while creatures he had grown to love fell victim to men whose only interest was profit gained through violence. Spirit seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, pressing close to Sam's side, as if offering whatever support a young horse could provide. The gesture filled Sam with determination and a growing understanding that his relationship with these wild creatures had created responsibilities he could not ignore. Sam rose before dawn the next morning, driven by an urgency that made sleep impossible. His plan to warn the wild herd required supplies and information, both of which could be obtained in Dry Creek if he moved quickly. The thought of those magnificent horses falling prey to Mackenzie's gang had haunted his restless night, filling his dreams with images of capture and suffering that made his chest tight with protective anger. Spirit seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, staying close to Sam as he prepared Thunder for the ride to town. The young horse's usual playful energy was replaced by a solemn attentiveness that reminded Sam of a soldier preparing for battle. When Sam mounted Thunder and prepared to leave, Spirit followed them to the edge of the property before stopping, as if recognizing that this particular journey was one he couldn't share. The ride to Dry Creek passed in a blur of autumn landscape and churning thoughts. Sam's mind raced through possible strategies for approaching the wild herd, ways he might communicate the danger that threatened them. The more he considered the challenge, the more impossible it seemed, but the alternative, doing nothing while trusting creatures faced capture by ruthless men, felt like a betrayal of everything Martha had taught him about protecting the innocent. Sheriff Tom Bradley was cleaning his rifle when Sam arrived at the small building that served as Dry Creek's law enforcement headquarters. Bradley was a competent man who'd kept the peace in their small community for nearly a decade, but his jurisdiction was limited and his resources few. The territorial nature of Mackenzie's crimes meant the gang could easily stay ahead of local law enforcement, striking quickly and disappearing into wilderness too vast for effective pursuit. "Sam!" Bradley greeted him with the weary respect of a man who'd seen too much violence in his years as a lawman. "I suppose you've heard about the horse thieves. Folks are getting mighty nervous about their livestock." "That's why I'm here," Sam replied, dismounting and tying Thunder to the hitching post. "I've been scouting my property, and I think I've spotted them. 5 riders moving along the northern ridges, headed toward the areas where the wild herds graze." Bradley's expression grew grave. "That matches what we've been hearing from other ranchers. This Mackenzie fellow seems to know exactly where to find the best horses in any territory he hits." The sheriff moved to a wooden desk, covered with papers, and pulled out a creased document. "The territorial marshal sent this wanted poster yesterday. Take a look and see if any of these faces match what you observed." Sam accepted the poster with hands that began trembling the moment his eyes focused on the central image. The face staring back at him from the crude drawing was one he hadn't seen in 20 years, aged and hardened by violence and cruelty, but unmistakably familiar. The features were sharper than he remembered. the eyes colder, but the bone structure and the distinctive scar above the left eyebrow were exactly as they had been during their childhood in Kentucky. Iron Pete Mackenzie was Peter Hartwell, his younger brother, who had disappeared from their family's life after a bitter argument with their father. Sam's hands shook as he read the description beneath the drawing. Leader of horse thievery ring operating throughout Wyoming territory, considered extremely dangerous, has killed at least 3 men during commission of crimes. Reward of $500 for information leading to capture. The sheriff noticed Sam's reaction immediately. You recognize him? That would be more help than we've had from anyone else who's seen this poster. Sam struggled to find his voice, his throat suddenly dry as desert sand. This man, Iron Pete Mackenzie, his real name is Peter Hartwell. He's my younger brother. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a gunshot, impossible to take back once spoken. Sheriff Bradley's eyebrows rose in surprise, but his expression remained professionally neutral as he processed this unexpected information. Your brother? Bradley asked carefully. Sam, I've known you for 7 years, and you've never mentioned having any family besides Martha. Sam sank into the chair beside Bradley's desk, the wanted poster still clutched in his trembling hands. Peter left home when he was 16, after a terrible fight with our father about his drinking and gambling. Father told him not to come back unless he was ready to live like a decent man. Peter said he'd rather die than live by the old man's rules. Sam's voice caught as memories flooded back. 3 years later, we got word from a sheriff in Colorado that he'd been killed in a saloon shooting. We never had reason to doubt it. The weight of this revelation crashed over Sam like a physical blow. The brother he'd mourned for 20 years had not only survived, but had become everything their father had feared he might become. A violent criminal who preyed on honest folks trying to build lives in the harsh frontier. The Peter he remembered had been quick to anger and slow to forgive, but he'd also shown remarkable gentleness with animals, spending hours caring for injured creatures with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his rebellious nature. Sam, Bradley said quietly, this changes things considerably. If your brother knows you're in this area, this might not be random. He might be coming here specifically because of you. The possibility had occurred to Sam the moment he recognized Peter's face, but hearing it spoken aloud made the threat feel more immediate and personal. His mind raced back through recent events, wondering if any of his neighbors might have mentioned his presence to strangers asking questions. The thought that Peter might have been tracking him, planning some form of confrontation after all these years, added a layer of danger Sam hadn't anticipated. There's more, Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. The wild horses I mentioned, I've formed a connection with them that goes beyond anything I've experienced. They trust me in ways that wild animals normally never trust humans. If Peter learns about that relationship, he might use it against me. Bradley leaned forward, his expression serious. What kind of connection are you talking about, Sam? Sam explained about rescuing Spirit, about the unprecedented trust shown by the wild stallion, about the growing bond that seemed to exist between him and creatures that had never known human kindness. As he spoke, he saw skepticism flicker in Bradley's eyes, but the sheriff had known him long enough to recognize honesty when he heard it. Assuming what you're telling me is true, Bradley said carefully, and assuming your brother somehow learns about your relationship with these horses, what do you think he might do? Sam closed his eyes, remembering the bitter young man who had left their family in anger 20 years earlier. Peter had always possessed a cruel streak when crossed, a tendency to strike at whatever might cause the most pain to those who opposed him. If he had indeed become the ruthless criminal described in the wanted poster, that cruelty would have grown and hardened into something truly dangerous. He'd hurt them, Sam said quietly. Not for money, not for any practical reason, but because he'd know it would destroy me. That's how Peter always fought. He found what you loved most and threatened to take it away. The ride home from Dry Creek felt like the longest journey of Sam's life. Every familiar landmark along the trail now seemed charged with new significance, transformed by the knowledge that his past was approaching in the form of a brother he'd believed dead for 20 years. The wanted poster remained folded in his shirt pocket, but Peter's face was burned into his memory, older, harder, marked by violence and years of choosing the wrong path at every crossroads. Thunder seemed to sense his rider's distress, moving with unusual caution, as if the Mustang understood that their peaceful world was about to be shattered. Behind them, the dust of their passage hung in the still air like a signal to anyone who might be watching, and Sam found himself studying every ridge and draw with the paranoia of a hunted man. When the homestead came into view, Spirit was waiting by the barn, his alert posture suggesting he'd been watching the horizon for their return. The young horse approached immediately, nuzzling Sam's leg with the gentle insistence that had become his way of offering comfort. The simple gesture nearly broke Sam's composure, reminding him of everything he stood to lose in the confrontation that was surely coming. Inside his cabin, Sam moved to the wooden chest where he kept his most precious possessions. Beneath Martha's wedding dress and the letters she'd written to him during their brief courtship lay his father's service revolver, a Colt Navy model that had seen action during the Mexican-American War. Samuel Hartwell Sr. had carried the weapon through battles that scarred him in ways he'd never fully explained to his sons, and he'd passed it to Sam with the solemn instruction that it should only be drawn to protect innocent life. The revolver felt heavier than Sam remembered as he lifted it from its resting place. The metal was still well maintained, the action smooth despite years of storage, but the weight of it seemed to carry more than just the physical burden of steel and gunpowder. This was the weapon their father had hoped neither of his sons would ever need to use, yet here Sam sat, preparing to possibly turn it on his own brother. Sam spent the afternoon cleaning and loading the revolver with methodical precision, each motion bringing back memories of lessons learned at his father's knee. A gun is a tool, not a solution, the old man had said. But when innocent lives are at stake, a man has a duty to stand between predator and prey, regardless of the cost. To himself, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Sam sat at his kitchen table and wrote a letter he hoped no one would ever need to read. The words came slowly, each sentence a struggle against emotions that threatened to overwhelm his practical preparation for what might come. "My dearest Martha," he began, "if you are reading this, then the choice has been taken from my hands, and I have gone to join you in whatever peace awaits beyond this troubled world. I want you to know that your love has sustained me through years that might otherwise have been unbearable, and that the courage you gave me has finally found its purpose." He wrote about Spirit, about the wild herd, about the impossible trust that had grown between him and creatures most men would never understand. He wrote about Peter, about the pain of discovering that his brother had become everything their father had feared. Most importantly, he wrote about his decision to stand between those he'd learned to love and those who would harm them, regardless of blood ties or personal cost. "I know you would tell me that violence solves nothing," he continued, "but I also know you would understand that some stands must be taken, some lines cannot be crossed without consequence. The horses have chosen to trust me, and I will not betray that trust, even if it costs me everything." As darkness fell across the homestead, Sam sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to Sheriff Bradley and placed it prominently on the kitchen table. Then he stepped onto his porch to face a decision he'd been avoiding since leaving town: where to make his stand when Peter finally arrived. The strategic part of his mind argued for the advantage of familiar ground, using his knowledge of every rock and tree on his property to even the odds against Peter's gang. But his heart rebelled against the idea of bringing violence to the place where he and Martha had built their dreams, where Spirit had learned to trust and heal. This sanctuary deserved protection from the corruption that Peter represented. The Choice became clear as Sam gazed toward the distant silhouette of Red Rock Canyon, barely visible in the starlight. That was where everything had begun, where he'd first heard Spirit's desperate cries, where the wild stallion had shown unprecedented trust, where the bond between man and horse had transcended every natural barrier. If this confrontation was to happen, it should happen there, in the place where Sam had discovered that love and protection were worth any sacrifice. Spirit approached through the darkness, his pale markings visible against his dark coat. The young horse pressed against Sam's side, offering the wordless comfort that had become their evening ritual. But tonight felt different. There was urgency in Spirit's behavior, a restlessness that suggested he sensed the approaching storm, as clearly as any wild creature could sense changes in the weather. "I have to go away for a while," Sam whispered, running his fingers through Spirit's mane. "I want you to stay here, stay safe. If I don't come back—" His voice caught on the words. "If I don't come back, you'll know what to do. You'll find your way back to the herd, back to where you belong." But Spirit shook his head vigorously, a gesture so human-like that Sam was momentarily startled. The young horse stepped back and whinnied softly, then moved toward the barn where Thunder waited. The message was clear. Wherever Sam was going, Spirit intended to follow. Sam spent a restless night, alternating between practical preparations and emotional preparation for a confrontation 20 years in the making. He cleaned his weapons, checked his supplies, and studied maps of the territory by lamplight. But between these concrete tasks, he found himself walking to Martha's grave behind the cabin, speaking to her about fears and hopes that he could share with no living soul. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted to the simple wooden cross that marked her resting place. "Peter was different when we were young, angry and wild, but never truly evil. What if there's still something of that boy left in the man he's become? What if I'm wrong about what he intends?" The wind through the cottonwoods provided no answers, but Sam found comfort in the ritual of speaking his doubts aloud. Martha had always been his conscience, the voice that reminded him to look for goodness even in difficult circumstances. Yet she'd also possessed a fierce protectiveness toward anything innocent and vulnerable, and Sam knew she would understand his determination to shield the horses from harm. Dawn found Sam saddling Thunder with equipment selected for both travel and potential conflict. His father's revolver rode in a worn holster on his right hip, while a rifle rested in a scabbard attached to his saddle. These were not weapons he'd ever imagined turning on his own brother, but Peter had forfeited any claim to family consideration when he'd chosen the path that led to violence against innocent people. Spirit waited by the barn, saddled and ready, despite Sam's repeated attempts to convince the young horse to remain safely at the homestead. There was determination in every line of Spirit's body, a resolution that matched Sam's own commitment to see this confrontation through to whatever end awaited them. As they prepared to leave, Sam took one last look around the homestead that had been his refuge and sanctuary for 7 years. The cabin stood solid and peaceful in the morning light. The small garden Martha had planted still producing vegetables in neat rows. The barn and corrals representing years of honest work and simple satisfaction. If he survived what was coming, he would return to this place and continue the quiet life he'd built from grief and determination. If he didn't, at least he would face his end, knowing he'd tried to protect creatures whose only crime was trusting a human who'd shown them kindness. The sun climbed higher as Sam and Spirit began their journey toward Red Rock Canyon, following paths that would take them away from everything safe and familiar toward a confrontation that would determine not only their own fates, but the future of the magnificent wild creatures who had chosen to trust them with their freedom. The morning sun was climbing toward its zenith when Sam reached the rim of Red Rock Canyon, the same vantage point from which he'd first observed the wild herd weeks earlier. Through his father's spyglass, he could see dust clouds approaching from the east, 5 riders moving with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to covering ground quickly while avoiding detection. Peter and his gang were less than an hour away from reaching the canyon, where this confrontation would finally unfold. Sam's hand moved unconsciously to the chain around his neck, where Martha's wedding ring hung beneath his shirt like a talisman, against the violence he hoped to avoid but was prepared to face. The simple gold band was warm against his chest, carrying with it memories of promises made and love shared, reminding him that some things were worth defending regardless of the personal cost. Spirit stood beside Thunder at the canyon's edge, both horses alert to the approaching danger in ways that their human companion could only envy. The young Mustang's nostrils flared constantly as he tested the wind for scents that might reveal the intentions of the approaching men, while Thunder's ears swiveled like compass needles, tracking the sounds of approaching hooves across the broken landscape. As the dust clouds grew closer, Sam made his final descent into the canyon, positioning himself near the spot where he'd first rescued Spirit from the thorny brush. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. If this confrontation was to end his life, at least it would happen in the place where he'd discovered that simple acts of compassion could create bonds stronger than blood, trust deeper than shared heritage. The sound of multiple horses entering the canyon echoed off the sandstone walls, amplified and distorted until it seemed like thunder rolling through the confined space. Sam remained perfectly still, one hand resting on his father's revolver while the other maintained a gentle contact with Spirit's neck. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine the fate of every creature he'd grown to love, and the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a mantle he'd never asked to wear. The riders appeared around the bend, in a formation that spoke of military precision corrupted by criminal purpose. Peter rode at their head on the grey stallion Sam had observed through his spyglass, but seeing his brother up close after 20 years was still a shock that nearly stole his breath. The young man who had left their family home in anger had been transformed by violence and hardship into something barely recognizable as human. Peter's face was scarred and weathered by years of outdoor living, but it was his eyes that revealed the true extent of his transformation. Where once there had been anger and frustration born of youth and inexperience, now there was cold calculation and a cruelty that seemed to find pleasure in others' suffering. This was no longer the troubled boy who had argued with their father about responsibility and proper behavior. This was a predator who had learned to profit from others' pain. "Hello, Samuel." Peter's voice carried across the canyon floor with the same mocking tone that had characterized their childhood conflicts. "Still playing savior to dumb animals, I see." Sam felt his heart breaking as he recognized traces of the brother he'd once loved beneath the hard mask of criminality. "Hello, Peter. I wondered if you might be the one they called Iron Pete Mackenzie." Peter's laugh was harsh and bitter, echoing off the canyon walls like the cry of a carrion bird. "Iron Pete serves my purposes better than the name our sainted father gave me, that Peter Hartwell died in a Colorado saloon 20 years ago, just like everyone believed." "Why?" Sam asked, the word carrying 20 years of grief and confusion. "Why did you choose this path? You could have come home, could have worked with me to build something worthwhile." "Worthwhile?" Peter's voice rose with genuine anger. "Like what? Like your pathetic little ranch where you hide from the world and talk to dead wives? Like spending my life breaking my back for a few dollars and the approval of people too stupid to see that strength takes what it wants?" The gang members behind Peter shifted restlessly in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with this personal conversation that had nothing to do with their criminal mission. But Peter held up a hand for silence, his attention focused entirely on the brother he hadn't seen in 2 decades. "I've been tracking you for months, Samuel. Ever since I heard there was a Hartwell running cattle in this territory. I wanted to see what kind of man my older brother had become." "Chut!" Peter's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "And I find you exactly as I expected. Weak, sentimental, wasting your life on creatures too stupid to appreciate your sacrifice." Sam felt Martha's ring warm against his chest. And with that warmth came a clarity that cut through his emotional turmoil. "I'm not weak, Peter. I've learned the difference between strength and cruelty, between protecting and possessing. That's something you never understood, even as a boy. Protecting." Peter's voice dripped with contempt. "Is that what you call hiding out here with your pet horse? Speaking of which, where are those famous wild mustangs I've been hearing about? My men are eager to see if they're worth the trouble of capturing." Before Sam could respond, the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with the unmistakable rhythm of approaching hooves. Both brothers looked toward the canyon entrance as the magnificent black stallion appeared, leading his herd down the rocky slopes with the same regal bearing Sam remembered from their first encounter. But this time was different. The wild horses descended into the canyon with purpose, arranging themselves not in a protective semicircle, but in a formation that clearly positioned them as allies rather than neutral observers. Spirit whinnied eagerly at their approach, his call answered by the stallion, with sounds that seemed to carry the weight of brotherhood and shared determination. The arrival of the wild herd transformed the canyon from a place of confrontation into something approaching a battlefield. Peter's men struggled to control their spooked mounts as dozens of wild horses positioned themselves strategically around the canyon floor, their movements coordinated with the precision of a military unit under the stallion's silent command. Sam watched in amazement as the black stallion approached him directly, showing none of the caution he might have displayed under normal circumstances. The great horse positioned himself between Sam and Peter's gang, his message unmistakable. Whatever conflict was about to unfold, the wild horses had chosen their side. Peter's expression shifted from confident mockery to something approaching uncertainty as he realized the scope of what he was witnessing. His men were clearly unnerved by the unprecedented behavior of the wild horses, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons, as if preparing for a threat they didn't understand. "Well, well," Peter said, his voice carrying a forced lightness that didn't quite mask his unease. "It seems you've managed to accomplish something our father never could. You've made friends with creatures that should fear you." Sam's hand moved to his shirt pocket, where he kept a small coil of braided horsehair rope he'd made during long winter evenings from Thunder's mane. The rope was useless for any practical purpose, but the meditative act of braiding it had helped him through the darkest months following Martha's death. Now, feeling its familiar texture beneath his fingers, Sam drew strength from the reminder of bonds that couldn't be broken by distance or time. "These horses chose to trust me because I never gave them reason to fear," Sam replied, his voice steady despite the tension that filled every muscle in his body. "That's something you never learned, Peter, that real strength comes from protection, not domination." Peter's face darkened with the familiar anger that had characterized so many of their childhood conflicts. "Still preaching, aren't you? Still trying to be the perfect son who does everything right?" He gestured toward his men, who began spreading out in an attempt to surround the small group at the canyon's center. "Let me show you what your precious friendship with these animals is worth." Before Sam could react, Peter drew his revolver and pointed it directly at Spirit. The young horse stood calmly beside Sam, showing no fear of the weapon that threatened his life, but Sam felt his heart stop as he realized what his brother intended. "No!" Sam shouted, throwing himself forward as Peter's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the canyon like thunder, followed immediately by the outraged screams of the wild horses. Sam felt the bullet tear through his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the rocky ground. Through the haze of pain and shock, he heard Spirit's frightened whinnying and the sound of horses moving with aggressive purpose. Peter's men found themselves surrounded by wild horses whose protective instincts had been triggered by the violence. The thieves' mounts reared and bolted, carrying their riders away from the canyon in a panic that left Peter alone and facing the consequences of his actions. "You took a bullet for a horse." Peter's voice cracked with something that might have been disbelief or admiration. "What kind of fool are you?" Sam struggled to his feet, his left arm hanging useless at his side, while blood seeped through his torn shirt. Spirit pressed against his uninjured side, offering what support a young horse could provide, while the black stallion moved closer, with eyes that blazed with protective fury. "The kind our father tried to raise us both to be," Sam replied, his voice hoarse with pain but steady with conviction. "The kind who stands between predator and prey, regardless of the cost." Peter's gun hand began to shake as he stared at his wounded brother. "This is insane, Samuel. They're just animals, dumb beasts who don't understand what you've sacrificed for them." "Look around you, Peter," Sam said softly. "Look at them and tell me they don't understand." For the first time since entering the canyon, Peter actually looked at the wild horses surrounding them. He saw the stallion's protective posture, the mares positioned to shield their foals, the coordinated movement that spoke of intelligence far beyond simple animal instinct. Most importantly, he saw Spirit pressing against Sam's wounded side with a gentleness that could only be described as love. The gun slipped from Peter's trembling fingers as 20 years of suppressed grief and regret finally broke through the barriers he'd built around his heart. "Samuel, God, what have I become?" The sound of his brother's breaking voice was more painful than the bullet wound in Sam's shoulder. He moved slowly toward Peter, Spirit staying close beside him, while the wild horses maintained their protective circle around the three figures at the canyon's center. "You've become someone who lost his way," Sam said gently, reaching out with his good arm to touch his brother's face. "But you're still my brother, and it's not too late to find your way home." 3 months after the confrontation in Red Rock Canyon, the Wyoming Territory morning air carried the crisp promise of winter as Sam stood on his porch, watching his brother split firewood with the methodical precision of a man seeking redemption through honest labor. Peter's movements had lost the predatory edge that had characterized his actions during his criminal years, replaced by the deliberate care of someone learning to find value in work done for its own sake, rather than for what it might steal from others. The bullet wound in Sam's shoulder had healed cleanly, leaving only a small scar and the occasional stiffness during cold weather to remind him of that terrible day when he'd been forced to choose between his brother's violence and an innocent creature's life. Dr. Henderson from Dry Creek had been amazed by the speed of his recovery, attributing it to what he called the healing power of purpose. Though Sam suspected the constant presence of Spirit and the wild herd had contributed more to his wellness than any medical treatment. Spirit had grown into a magnificent young stallion during the autumn months, his coat gleaming with health and his bearing reflecting the confidence that came from being loved and valued. Though he remained technically wild, never accepting saddle or bridle, he'd become Sam's constant companion, following him through daily chores with the devotion of a creature who'd chosen his family based on trust rather than blood. The wild herd still visited the homestead regularly, their presence no longer causing surprise among the neighboring ranchers who'd grown accustomed to seeing magnificent Mustangs grazing peacefully alongside domestic cattle. The black stallion had become something approaching a friend, accepting treats from Sam's hands and allowing him to examine injured members of the herd when his healing skills were needed. It was a relationship unprecedented in the territory's history, spoken of in hushed, reverent tones by cowboys who understood they were witnessing something that defied natural law. Peter's transformation had been as remarkable as it was gradual. The bitter, violent man who'd entered Red Rock Canyon with murder in his heart had slowly given way to someone Sam recognized from their childhood. The boy who'd spent hours nursing injured rabbits back to health, who'd cried when their father had been forced to put down a lame horse. The criminal shell that had encased that gentler nature for 20 years was finally cracking, revealing glimpses of the brother Sam had mourned and missed. The territorial marshal had arrived 2 weeks after the canyon confrontation, prepared to arrest Peter for his crimes, but the testimonies of local ranchers about his genuine efforts at reform had convinced the lawman to offer an alternative. Peter would remain in the territory under Sam's supervision, working to make restitution for his crimes through labor and by sharing information about other criminal gangs operating in the region. It was an unusual arrangement, but the frontier justice system sometimes found wisdom in allowing men the chance to prove they could change. Sam had started a new leather journal to document this phase of his life. Its pages filled not with the simple accounting of cattle and weather that had characterized his previous records, but with observations about the profound connections that had transformed his existence. The journal rested on his kitchen table. Now, its latest entry, describing Peter's first successful attempt to approach one of the wild mares without causing her to flee. November 15th, 1847, the entry read. Peter spent 2 hours today sitting perfectly still while the mare with the white blaze gradually approached close enough to take an apple from his outstretched hand. When she finally accepted the gift, I saw tears in my brother's eyes, the first time I've witnessed genuine emotion from him since his return. There is something about these horses that reveals the truth in people's hearts, stripping away pretense to show what lies beneath. The sound of approaching hooves drew Sam's attention to the horizon, where he could see the familiar silhouette of Jacob Caldwell riding toward the homestead. His neighbor had become a regular visitor since Peter's arrival, ostensibly checking on the brothers' welfare, but actually fascinated by the ongoing drama of redemption and healing that was unfolding before his eyes. "Morning, Sam," Jacob called as he dismounted near the porch. "I see Peter's making good progress on that firewood." "He works from dawn to dusk," Sam replied, pride evident in his voice. "Sometimes I have to remind him to rest. It's like he's trying to make up for 20 years of wrong choices all at once." Jacob nodded approvingly. "The folks in town are starting to talk about him differently. Not Iron Pete the horse thief, but Peter Hartwell, Sam's brother who's trying to make things right." He paused, watching a spirit approach them with the easy familiarity of a family pet. "And this young stallion of yours continues to amaze everyone who sees him." Sam ran his hand along Spirit's neck, marveling as always at the trust the animal showed in human contact. "He's not really mine, Jacob. He's chosen to stay, but he remains free to leave whenever he feels called to rejoin the wild herd completely." "But he doesn't leave," Jacob observed, "just like your brother chose to stay and work rather than running when he had the chance. Seems to me both of them found something here they couldn't find anywhere else." As if summoned by their conversation, Peter approached from the woodpile, his shirt damp with honest sweat, and his face showing the healthy color that came from outdoor labor and regular meals. The hardness that had characterized his features for 20 years was gradually being replaced by something gentler, more reminiscent of the boy he'd been before anger and pride had led him astray. "Afternoon, Mr. Caldwell," Peter said respectfully, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy their father had insisted upon during their childhood. "Sam, I've got enough wood split to last through December, but I thought I might ride out and check on the northern fence line if you don't need me for anything else." Sam smiled at his brother's eagerness to contribute, to find worth in the small tasks that kept a homestead functioning. "That would be helpful. Take Thunder. He knows that territory better than any of us." As Peter headed toward the barn, Jacob shook his head in amazement. "If I hadn't known Iron Pete Mackenzie by reputation, I'd never believe that gentle soul was the same man. What do you suppose made the difference?" Sam considered the question while watching Spirit join the wild herd members who had begun gathering in the nearby pasture for their daily visit. The sight never failed to move him, dozens of magnificent wild horses mingling peacefully with domestic animals, defying every natural law while creating something beautiful and unprecedented. "I think," Sam said slowly, "it was the same thing that changed my life when I found Spirit in that canyon. Sometimes the greatest rescues happen both ways. I thought I was saving a trapped foal, but what really happened was that those horses saved my soul. And now they're saving Peter's too." As the sun settled toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sam reflected on the chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. A simple act of compassion toward a wounded creature had created bonds stronger than blood, trust deeper than fear, and hope more powerful than the darkest parts of human nature. The wild herd grazed peacefully in the gathering twilight, while Spirit moved among them like an ambassador between two worlds. Somewhere beyond the mountains, winter was approaching with its promise of harsh weather and difficult choices. But here in this small valley where wild and domestic had learned to coexist, where brothers had found their way back to each other, through the wisdom of creatures that understood love without condition, the future held nothing but possibility.